Welcome to Nano Matters, the podcast that explores examples of nanotechnology. I'm Lisa Friedersdorf, Director of the National Nanotechnology Coordination Office. Here with me today is Jeff Blackburn, a Senior Scientist and Group Manager at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So Jeff, I understand that you're exploring novel materials for energy-efficient computing. Can you tell us a little bit about your research?
So this is a really new field for us, which is kind of a fun thing for chemists and material scientists. We get to play in a lot of different fields. And we have recently begun looking at this field kind of out of serendipity. We have an Energy Frontier Research Center, and so those are called EFRCs, and they're funded out of the Department of Energy. And with our EFRC, it's called CHOICE, which is the Center for Hybrid Organic Inorganic Semiconductors for Energy. And basically, we look at these interesting materials called perovskite semiconductors, a super broad class of materials based on a mineral that was discovered all the way back in the 1800s and researched in the early 1900s. And it really had a resurgence of interest in the 1990s, and then about 12 years ago, really, when some folks discovered that it can make for a very efficient solar cell. These metal halide perovskites, since they started being incorporated into solar cells back in 2009, went from about 4% efficient all the way up to about 26% efficient last year. So that's a huge, rapid increase in efficiency for a material that's very cool because you can kind of solution process it. So you can take an ink of that material and just spray it on a surface and make a 26% efficient solar cell, which is really cool compared to something like silicon, where it takes a lot of energy and time and sophisticated equipment to make these efficient solar cells. So we were originally looking at some interfaces that we thought would be interesting to explore for perovskite photovoltaics. We have used single-walled carbon nanotubes as electrodes in perovskite photovoltaics, and they like to extract charges from those photovoltaic active layers really well. And so we originally had an inkling that, what we were studying would make for some cool findings for photovoltaics or other things like light-emitting diodes. But when we started making these little devices, we made these little devices called phototransistors, and we like to simulate what happens when you hit them with sunlight by using lasers of a specific wavelength. And so usually when you hit one of these types of materials with a pulse of light, when the light's on, you'll generate some photocurrent, and then you turn the light off and that photocurrent goes away. But with this material, we hit it with a pulse of light and turned the light off, and the photocurrent didn't go away. It just stuck around. And so even if we used a pulse of light that was less than a millisecond long, our photocurrent stuck around for hours. And so that was really not what we expected whatsoever. And it just so happened that at the time we were working with a group of collaborators on a proposal based around neuromorphic computing. And we started realizing that some of the effects we were seeing with this system were probably related to the way ions move around in the material once you hit it with light. And that type of ion movement is actually desirable and something that you can use in neuromorphic materials. And it's actually something that you really want. You want to be able to hit this with a short either electrical pulse or light pulse and have the memory of that pulse stick around for a long time as photocurrent. And so we started digging into it a lot more and realized that there was some nice connectivity there. And what we originally thought was a bad result that we weren't looking for turned into be a really good result, but for a different field. So that was kind of cool. And it sent us into this different direction and trying to understand how this material might be used for neuromorphic computing. And it can essentially be what's called an optical memory or optical synapse. And that kind of sent us down that road.
So can you discuss a little bit about what you mean by neuromorphic and how it's different than, the computer laptop that people are used to using now?
Yeah, absolutely. So neuromorphic computing energy efficient computing in general is a big field these days because transmitting and storing and processing all these huge amounts of data that we generate now accounts for about 10% of our global energy use. So it's a staggering number. The brain can actually process and encode and transmit data in a really energy efficient way. There's a cool story that some listeners might have experience with or remember from all the way back in 2011, where IBM had this supercomputer named Watson that competed against two Jeopardy champions over this multi-day competition. The computer ended up winning. But if you think about what went into that win, that computer was operating at about a level of 100,000 watts, which is 10 to the fifth watts. And so in contrast, the way our brains work, all those human contestants, their brains were working at a consumption of about 10 watts. So that's, 5 orders of magnitude difference in the amount of power you're consuming. And the humans don't have to have a whole entire room of these cooling fans behind them to cool off all that heat that's generated by that huge amount of energy. So I think that's kind of still a big win for evolution in my book. And so the reason that the human brain can operate relatively efficiently or at much lower power consumptions is because of the way in which synapses and neurons are connected in this really massively parallel interconnected network. So there's billions of neurons in our brains, and they're all each connected on average to many other thousands of neurons. And because of that, they can do computing, memory, and transmission functions all in the same fabric, right? They don't have to take data and shuttle it over to memory and then shuttle it back to do processing with it. And all those steps in a normal computer take a ton of energy. So yeah, that's one of the reasons I think that the brain can operate so much more efficiently than a normal laptop or supercomputer or what have you. And so material scientists and other types of scientists are working on making materials and devices that mimic the way synapses and neurons work in our brain. And that's really the field of neuromorphic computing in a nutshell. It's much more complex than that, obviously, but when you get right down to it, it's trying to emulate those individual elements of the brain that allow it to do that computing, and to also mimic the way in which signals are sent across to different neurons, and all these different connectivities between neurons are made, and how memories are stored in that way and retrieved and processed.
So the strategy that you're using to mimic the brain and these different elements that are used to translate information at low power in a human brain are optical components. So can you describe how you're using the crystals that you talked about earlier in this application?
Yeah, in our case, in the brain, the majority of the signals that you're passing along from neuron to neuron, it's really based on a neuron sending a short little electrical pulse to the synapse, and the synapse sends chemicals, some neurotransmitters across to another neuron, and that then defines the way the other neuron on the other side generates a new signal. You can either stimulate it to generate a new signal, or you can make it less likely to generate a new signal. And in our case, we're using photons, so it's not an electrical pulse that we're sending into our materials, it's a light pulse. And in a way, this can eventually, we're making very small individual elements, but if you start to put these elements together into bigger arrays and things like that, you can hopefully mimic the way that our retina processes information by taking in optical signals from light of different wavelengths and different intensities and things like that. And it operates on a similar principle that the neurons and synapses in the brain work, but it's based on sending neurotransmitters across membranes and things like that. So yeah, it's in a way we're trying to use these materials, these nanomaterials, to mimic the way a retina might process information. In our case, the interface that we made, basically, it allows you to transfer some charge from one material to the other. And the electric field that builds up across that interface then moves some ions around, and it kind of mimics the way that ions are sent across a synapse in the human brain or the retina. And that's what allows you to process that light pulse into a photocurrent and do other types of behaviors with it.
Can you share some things that you've determined that surprised you, like some findings that perhaps were unexpected? And then what are some of the big challenges that you and your colleagues are working on in order to realize this type of computing?
Yeah, and there's a lot of remaining challenges for sure. We didn't really expect to see this really, really long-lived, persistent photoconductivity. We kind of expected to see photoconductivity that was relatively short-lived. The fact that it lasts for hours across a really thin interface. These materials are about 50 nanometers total thickness. The fact that you can get them to retain that photoconductivity for such a long time was really interesting to us and quite unexpected. And as we dug further into it, I think we originally didn't think that perovskite nanocrystals in particular would be a material set that would give us this type of result. But when we uncovered a little bit more about the mechanism, it started to make sense, because the way ions move around in these types of materials is they really like to move along surfaces and grain boundaries. And so we had unwittingly chosen a material that has tons and tons of surfaces and grain boundaries, and we kind of were able to optimize that effect that we weren't originally looking for. So it was kind of serendipitous in that manner. And then I think the second important piece was the photon piece. These perovskite materials and the ways in which ions move around is they move around a lot more easily when you're illuminating the sample than when they're in the dark. And so that's one of the reasons that when we turn the light off, it takes a long time to get back to their original positions, is we're sitting there illuminating them and the ions can move around fairly easily. They find some new positions and they trap some charge carriers in their new positions. And then we turn the light off and it takes a lot more energy for them to move back to their original positions. And that's one of the reasons we think that we get such long-lived changes in conductivity. And so that was kind of surprising to us, but now that we've dug a little bit more into the system, it kind of makes sense. Some of the challenges that we're still trying to address for the research going forward is you want these types of materials and devices to operate under incredibly low energies. That's one of the main advantages of neuromorphic computing, is that you can, in theory, do computations, process information at much lower energy. And so we're still on a quest to modify this material system and develop new materials that operate at even lower energies. And then we're also on a quest to start to build up more complex materials and systems. So the paper that we just published was kind of the simplest type of small device we could have made. And the next step would be to actually start to couple a lot of those simple devices into more complex arrays, the way in which your neurons are interconnected in the brain. And that's really the way that you can start to do more complex learning and information processing type behaviors, is utilizing the way those individual elements then talk to each other across the array and stuff like that. And so that's one of the next steps for us, is really starting to get more complex with those devices and how they communicate with each other. The community as a whole has a pretty big, grand challenge ahead of it in terms of designing all these complex pieces and systems in conjunction with each other instead of in a kind of an isolated fashion. There's this concept of co-design, which I think is really important in a field like this, which basically says that you need folks that are working on the individual elements, so material scientists and physicists and chemists that are working on these individual materials and elements. You need those folks talking to folks that are developing circuits. So there's circuit designers and folks that are working with, how you get the individual elements to talk to each other in realistic ways. I mean, what types of signals are the individual elements sending? What are the magnitudes of those signals? What are the time constants of those signals? And then you need all of those people to be able to talk to the researchers who are developing architectures and algorithms that will take all of those signals and the processed signals and use them to make algorithms that can solve real problems, and that can solve real problems in a more energy efficient manner and in a manner that helps you process information in the right way. And so it's kind of a huge challenge to get folks across these different disciplines that, normally collaborate with others within their own discipline. But then how do you get those folks talking to folks in completely other disciplines, like getting a material scientist to talk to an algorithm developer? It doesn't always happen. Sometimes it does, but it doesn't always happen. And so I think making those connections and having folks develop these technologies in that co-design way instead of in isolation is a huge challenge for this field and other fields as well, but this is one that is particularly applicable for.
So thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. Do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners?
All the problems that we need to solve for society really can't be tackled by a single field or a single discipline. So recognizing where those synergies and commonalities are and how you can work with others across disciplines to tackle huge problems is a fun thing. It's a challenging thing and a daunting thing sometimes, but it's, I think, where we'll solve big problems of the future.